I always had a wanderer's soul, but by my late 20s, I was getting really tired of moving around constantly, and I actually wanted roots. By early 2018, I had those. I was thriving in every respect. I had a government job, I had lots of friends, I had more money than I needed, and I had a beautiful red motorcycle that I was absolutely in love with. I was, for the first time in my adult life, truly comfortable. And it was a slow, easy kind of comfort that peaked on a Friday afternoon in early January when I had just gotten off work and had a long weekend stretched out ahead of me. And it was full, brimming with opportunity. And I decided to go to Chipotle on my way home from work to pick up a tasty meal from my roommate who had been feeling a bit blue. And I can still feel the warm thrum of the engine of my bike as I was riding down Laguna Boulevard with nothing but green lights. And I can still hear the little voice in my head go, "No, no, no," as a dark car pulled across both lanes of traffic and completely blocked anywhere for my motorcycle to go. It was like a brick wall had come up between me and the future that I had been trying to build. And I slammed into that car, going about 40 miles an hour. The actual impact is really hazy, but I distinctly remember the crack as the back of my helmet hit the pavement. And then there was a police officer standing above me, and paramedics came and stripped off all of my motorcycle gear and put me into an ambulance. And the aluminum doors banged closed, sirens wailed, and they whisked me off to Kaiser Trauma Center, leaving behind my crumpled motorcycle and the shattered remains of that comfortable life that I had been building, scattered across the pavement like broken glass.
But all your friends and family seem to notice how big it gets to you when you are ready. I am telling you all my thoughts as you empty out your pockets for the plane ticket that you lost. Be safe, you fool, in New York City. Be safe, you fool, in New York City. I will break you in. I've tried it before, I'll try it again. But if this time you feel your shell is gone too thin, I will lend you my skin. I'd lend you my skin. Heard you were rolling in the good times out west. Went to the desert to find your destiny and place. Did they set you straight in your life crisis? Did you see me floating there above your body line? Angels suspended or an enemy you failed to recognize? Was I there
welcome and thank you for being here. This is Brandon Case, who was a PCT hiker back in 2020. And as we saw, and as he talked about, it's an amazing journey of healing, you know. Does nature heal? You know, that's the beauty of this. And so we're going to start out with asking Brandon a couple questions here and see where we can go. And also keep in mind, too, that as we come to intermission, we will have a Q&A afterwards. So we're going to put a whole bunch of index cards up here with pencils, and if you have any questions, please feel free to fill them out and drop them in the little bucket. So getting that out of the way as we talk. And so the big question is, Brandon, you're going to work, everything's okay. It could happen to any of us. And after talking to you, you go in, they do x-rays, they keep you for 6 hours, see that your brain isn't bleeding and discharge you. So what comes next?
Yeah, so I was in Kaiser. They did a ton of tests, which was uncomfortable at times, but and then stuck me on a gurney in the hallway because the hospital was overbooked, and I was there for about 6 hours, and they discharged me, and I went home. My roommate actually took me home. Unfortunately, we didn't have that dinner that I had planned, so I started having progressively more symptoms from the traumatic brain injury as time went on. In the very beginning, your brain's kind of like in massive alarm mode and is sucking all the glucose out of your system, so it takes a little while for that stuff to start to resolve sometime. But I had a horrible headache that was nonstop for the next couple of months, and then I started getting all sorts of other weird disturbances to me, my autonomic nervous system, my brain that controlled my entire body and kept me from falling over unexpectedly, and kept my heart, in the right rhythm, and kept me breathing when I was sleeping or, trying to be alive. But it was awful. And you get about 18 months of a recovery window where doctors are expecting you to continue progressing, and then at a certain point, at about 18 months, they just kind of shut you off, and they're like, this is where you're going to be now, and you kind of got to make amends with the symptoms that you have remaining. And I was still really messed up at that point, and no short-term memory, all kinds of fatigue, and had these awful, awful headaches that just, the kind of pain where you're just trying to make time continue forward, like ticking forward 1 second at a time, and nothing relieved it. Opioids blunted a little bit, but it was always there, and yeah. So I was pretty desperate, and I stayed in that room for 2 years in this little room, just trying to get my brain to knit back together, and yeah. And then I discovered. Actually, one of my friends was going to take a trip up to Oregon, and she brought me with her, which was really awesome because it got me out into the forest for the first time in a long time. And I had had a lot of difficulty breathing during this entire period because my brain wasn't telling my body to breathe naturally. And when I was out in the forest for the first time, it felt like I could breathe again. And that just happened to coincide with me finding this post on Reddit about a hiker that did one of these long distance trails and who had a TBI and saw extra recovery even though they were outside of the recovery window. And I was like, this is it. This is where I need to be. And within 6 months of that, I was at Mexico on the border, ready to hike north to Canada.
And we know it took a lot of preparation, and you had preparation time, so here you are taking the big chance, and like we saw in the picture, tell us about your first week or two, because you had every chance to quit after that as well.
It was an unusually rough start. I knew that I was dealing with a lot physically. I was very deconditioned from having sat in a room for 2 years And so I knew it was going to take me a long time to actually complete the trail. So I left really early. I got a very early start date. So I started on March 10th, which is about a month and a little bit before most people start the trail. And that also meant that when I got to Mexico and started hiking up into the mountains, it was constantly raining. Like, it was just dumping rain for the first 3 weeks, and I was like miserably cold. I think the coldest that I've ever been in my life, and this is considerable, especially given some of the events that happened later in the mountains, but was going into some of those early trail towns where I had just been soaked with water for, hours and hours and hours throughout the day, wearing extra gloves on my hands, or extra socks on my hands just to try to keep them warm when I was holding my trekking poles. And it was tremendously difficult. It was a rough way to start, and then that just continued actually into those first mountains with snow and all kinds of craziness.
So I think about, okay, I've planned this big hike. I'm going to start off, and it's just like I haven't even started yet, and it's pretty messed up. So I think I'll turn around, and I mean, it just. You just kept going, because then you walk into, how far was San Jacinto? 2 weeks?
Yeah, just a few weeks in. And I was really determined. Like, there was nothing that was gonna get me to quit that I could foresee anyway, because for me this was an opportunity to really do something awesome. Like, I had lived most of my life really accumulating stories and living kind of like the protagonist of my own life. And I had a lot of stories from the accident, but they were all really tragic stories. And so I really wanted like an awesome adventure story. And this was a chance for me to kind of succeed and prove to myself that I could still, be a functioning person. So I was bound and determined to go through. And I hit San Jacinto after a few weeks, and it was gnarly. Like, a big storm cycle went through, and it was absolutely covered in snow. When I stopped in Idlewild, I tried to time my entry back up into the mountains, because San Jacinto is the first like really high mountain that's pretty dangerous and gets very, very cold. And so I went up, and the forecast had a little bit of snow at about 7 p.m. for like a couple hours, and I was usually in bed by that point anyway in my tent. But so I climbed up the mountain, and by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, it was a whiteout blizzard, and nobody had been up there since the storm, so it was just completely snow everywhere, no trail. I was navigating by GPS, just kind of like stumbling through the forest, going across these big ice sheets that were like glass, and they had old footprints that had been covered over with powder, so I was like feeling with my toes, trying to find these hidden footsteps to get across it. So I'm going like half a mile an hour before I finally get to where I had intended to camp at the edge of Fuller Ridge, and there's no ground anywhere. It's all snow. So I like stomp down a rectangle that I can lay my tent out into, and try to anchor the tents down, but the stakes are pulling out because it's all this powder and everything else, and the wind's whipping. And I actually ended up, my tent had like a main stake that connected all the doors and everything, and I ended up peeing on that stake in order to create a block of ice, which was the anchor for my tent that night. And by that point, the temperature was down into the teens, and the wind chill was in the single digits, and my my down quilt that I was planning to carry through the whole trail was only rated for 20 degrees. So I like crawl into my tent in my quilt, and I'm just shivering, and I'm just eating, trying to get some energy going, and have all of my gear like piled over me and stuffed into my quilt to create insulation. And I eventually made it through that night, but it scared me a bit, not least because when I left and got back down to service, a couple days after that, I learned that a guy that was about 20 miles behind me on the trail had actually slipped off of one of those slopes and died that same night that I was going through all of that craziness with the cold. So it was a big wake-up call, but even that, I was still set on continuing.
So as you're walking now, you're a couple weeks into it, how do you feel? I mean, so talk about a few of the like short-term memory and then the threshold, is that what you called it?
Yeah, it's the post-threshold symptoms. So for when you're recovering from a TBI, usually you get, so you have all these horrible symptoms, and then as time goes on, you develop kind of a little bit of a window of activity that you can do, where if you push too hard, if you stare at screens, that was a big problem for me, or push yourself too hard for too long, more than like half an hour or so, then you pass this threshold and all of the TBI symptoms roll back in like a cascade that basically floors you. And so for me, hiking, I was really trying to avoid doing that, which was difficult, and also recover, which was also very difficult. I had sleep apnea. My brain wouldn't tell my body to keep breathing when I was asleep, which normally it's like obstructive, but it was central sleep apnea where it was all my brain not doing its thing, and that became a real problem. So I was never recovering. I had to spend about 12 hours in the tent at night, just laying there trying to get enough energy for the next day. I'd get all wobbly and stuff. And anytime I went past the threshold, then I'd start to get confused, and I'd get one of those horrible, horrible headaches and everything else that would really kind of put me down for the count. So it was very difficult, especially in the beginning part. And my short-term memory also was just like absolutely garbage. I was keeping a journal, and I had my notes app on my phone where I was writing the journal, and then I had my GPS app that had where my mileage was, and so I was tracking my mileage. But I couldn't remember the short, 3-digit or 4-digit number of my mileage between that screen on my phone and then the notes app on my phone. So I'd have to go back and forth several times just copying over each digit because I just could not remember that very short number between going back and forth. So that's kind of the state that I started this whole ordeal in.
And did those alleviate as you went?
Yeah, as I started to keep going forward, they did start to get better. I was going over these huge mountains, and you get all this blood that's pumping through your system, highly oxygenated. You're in the forest, and nature's awesome in and of itself. So I think it kind of mimics one of the leading TBI therapies that's people use right now is called hyperbaric oxygen chambers. And I think this had a similar function where it was super saturating the damaged tissues in my brain with oxygen. And so as I was going along, especially getting up to about 700 or 1,000 miles, then I was starting to remember more of those digits as I was going back and forth between the apps on my phone. My things started to get a little bit better in those ways, and also a little bit worse in others, because as I went up in elevation, all of those problems that kept me from recovering, where I wasn't sleeping and breathing properly at night, those all got worse. And so when I started getting up into the high elevations, I would basically kind of choke and sputter my way through the night, according to one of the people that I hiked with who had to listen to me when we were going to go up one of the mountains. But yeah, it was difficult. Yeah, but it did start to get better, and then that was a trend that continued as I went along.
So most people, when they start the PCT, they've got these ideals of, I'm going to cover this many miles every day, and here we go, and out of the gate they go and try to do 20 miles after not hiking. And so let's give them a little bit of your backpack experience coupled with the fact that you have been in bed for 2 weeks, and what did that produce on your start?
Right. So I had never been backpacking before, and I had spent a lot of time in nature with my dad as a kid. So I had like essential nature skills, like I could make a fire, but I'd never actually gone out with a backpack and carried everything that I needed on down the trail. So that was brand new to me. Plus, I was completely deconditioned from sitting in that room for 2 years. So I started out. I think my first day I did about 5 miles. And then I actually forced myself to limit how far I went each day, starting at about 10 miles, and then 12 miles, and then about 15, and then it kind of continued ramping up as I went along, because I really didn't want to injure myself and risk the entire trip, which happens pretty frequently. A lot of people that don't end up finishing go in really strong at the beginning, and they want to do 25 miles a day, And before your body's ready to do that, and my body was like not at all ready, then you start getting overuse injuries and everything falls apart. So I was determined to plod my way north, and I gave myself enough time to do that.
Because, yeah, what did, a 1 week snow trip in the high snow in 2017. And my problem was we get up there and we walk in and we don't have 700-mile legs, and that was the hardest flipping thing that I've ever done. And so now by this point, you're rolling through the Sierra and you had an early start. So explain what an early start means when you hit the Sierra.
Right, and so a lot of people go into the Sierra in like mid-June or later. They really want to wait for the snow to melt out, so it's easier to, climb up and down the mountains. But I knew that I needed more time than on average anyway, and I learned about what's known as the secret season, where you go early so that which has many benefits. I am a strong proponent of this, but you miss out on like the mosquitoes, and then also I went into the Sierra on like May 10th, I think, which is ridiculously early, but every night it still freezes at that point, so you're able to walk on top of the snow instead of post-holing. Post-holing is the worst. That's where you're on deep snow, and every step you put down, your foot just sinks straight through, and you drop like 2 or 3 feet, and then you have to climb back on top of the snow and take another step, and it starts to just destroy the tendons in your knees and everything else. So I went into the Sierra super early, and it was very cold, and I had to get up really early in the morning. Like when we started doing the major mountains, I was getting up at like 3 o'clock in the morning to do Forester and all of that. And because of my experience on San Jacinto, I collected a little group in Kennedy Meadows. So there were 4 of us that did a few of the major passes, and then we all kind of split up after that. But yeah, it was a bit wild to go in that early, but it was also cool because there was nobody in the Sierra, which was a kind of a theme for my experience, and you get really these awesome, beautiful mountains, and they were just like absolutely sparkled with all the snow, and you'd get awesome storm clouds that would kind of flirt with the area, and you really hope they didn't come in and snow you into the wrong side of a mountain. And it was very exciting and very beautiful and very, very cold, but it was great.
And so, very cold, but it was very great.
Yeah.
So, you started in 2020,
yeah.
which is basically the pandemic year.
Mm-hmm.
And when we went up and did our trail magic that season, we saw 1/10 of the people that we normally saw. So explain how that all set in and what happened and your feelings and the communities that you would go into and
right.
things like that.
So yeah, it was an unorthodox year to be hiking in many respects. The pandemic kind of hit a few weeks after I started the trail. I was out in the middle of nowhere in the mountains, and then I came back into service, and my phone just blew up with text messages, people being like, "The world is ending," and I was like, "Okay, I gotta figure this out now." But yeah, so it was interesting. A lot of people had to go home. A lot of international people had to go home or risk being stuck away from their families and everything else. And I got to, for me, it was oddly fortunate in the sense that a lot of the people that normally kind of party on the trail and have a raucous time, which was not really the experience that I was looking for. I was looking for more of the quiet nature time. A lot of them went home, and so it was odd and interesting, and it had its ups and its downs. As far as interacting with towns, like I pretty much had all of my food shipped to me to post offices, so I just mask up and go into the post office and get my box, and then shove all my new food in my backpack and be back out in the wilderness. I probably had less interaction with people than anybody else that year. And anytime that I did go into towns, the businesses and everything were really, really grateful, which was interesting because the online community was really toxic that year. But the actual people that I interacted with were awesome and respectful and really grateful for any of the business. If I was able to purchase some food from their store or whatever to supplement what came in the mail. So it was definitely an unusual experience, but again, beautiful in its own right.
Yeah, and so with that said, how many people get to experience Yosemite with nobody around?
It was a once-in-a-lifetime experience. It was interesting. The Forest Service kept the PCT open, and all the parks were closed, but they set up a special kind of like permit for PCT hikers to be able to hike through Yosemite. And so I went through the entire Yosemite Park with nobody else in the park, which is just insane. As I'm sure you know. And so, there were like bears and, deer and everywhere, because it was awesome. That had its drawbacks as well, because I had a resupply that was supposed to go to the Tuolumne Meadows post office. And my friend who was organizing the resupplies, actually there was a picture of us on that little roll, Shelby, who was awesome. I was like, please make sure that the post office in Yosemite is still open. And so she called, but apparently the Tuolumne Meadows post office and the Yosemite Valley post office are in the same building with the same guy. And so she called and she was like, are you guys open? And he was like, yeah, of course we are. And so she sent them my resupply, but it went to the wrong post office. So I get into Tuolumne Meadows, and it looks like a post-apocalyptic wasteland. Like, they have all these buildings that have, canvas roofs that they can remove. And so you have these buildings that have their roofs removed, and they have like plants growing up from the middle of the buildings, and no resupply box sitting in the middle of it. And so I ran out of food in Yosemite, and I had about 4 days that I needed to go to Sonora Pass, and I was like out of food. Fortunately, I had brought a little Tenkara fishing rod. It's a fly fishing rod that's about 11 feet long. It's really cool. They collapse down to be about this big, and they weigh about 3.5 ounces. And so I was out of food, and I had to either hike out of Yosemite on one of the closed roads, which would have taken forever to try to find a store and resupply, or I could just push through and try to hit Sonora and scavenge what food I could. So I stopped every evening to fish, and I searched every bear box that was in Yosemite, and so I found some food from the previous season. I had like expired cheese and 1 or 2 Mountain House meals that I found, and then I had a ridiculous amount of trout, which was great because that was some of the best fishing that I've ever had. There were some pictures of the fish that were up there on that roll too. One in particular was the best fish that I caught on the trail. It was amazing. It was a 15-inch rainbow trout, and I was standing on this log in the middle of a creek, and it's sight fishing because the water's so clear you can see exactly where the fish are, and so you're just trying to like hide from them as you're casting out. And I just watched this big fish come up and smash my fly, and I was like, yes, because I like really needed to eat it, and I like brought him in, and went and cooked it, and it was interestingly, this was the one night that I saw another person in Yosemite. It was a hiker going the opposite direction who had flip-flopped or was doing something like that, and so we were in this little camp, and he was in the camp that I was planning on staying in. And he had set up his tent right next to where the fire pit was, which is a little bit odd, but fine. And so I cooked my fish on the fire, and I had actually caught 4 of them, so I had a nice meal. And and he left. He was not being very social, which I was okay with. But he went into his tent and went to sleep while I was still cooking my fish, and I was really kind of conscious of the fact that I was making noise and a bunch of light and stuff. And so normally I would just let the fish bones burn away in the fire before I doused it, but I doused it a little bit earlier, trying to be considerate, and then went to bed. And when a fire burns down, even after you douse it, once the residual heat evaporates all of that moisture, you kind of get this big plume of scent, and usually it's this really kind of nice, wild, fire scent from a campfire. But that particular night, that scent was 150% cooked fish. And it just emanated across the countryside. And I had seen a bunch of bear scat earlier that day, and I was like, this is going to call every bear in like 50 miles. And so I was like, and I woke up smelling the smell at about midnight, and I was like, well, nothing I can do about it now, so I just kind of rolled over and went back to sleep. And then, of course, like half an hour later, you get this big crash as like this bear steps on a branch and breaks it. And the most interesting, bizarre thing about bears when you're out in the middle of the nowhere, because I saw a number of them, but you can hear their breath. Like they have this really deep, like strong breath that's unmistakable in the middle of the night. And so this bear like ambles by my tent and goes right up to the fire and kind of like starts pawing at it. And he's literally about 2 feet from this guy's tent. And that dude, you can hear the crinkle of his mattress because all these Thermarest mattresses crinkle. And so you can hear him just kind of like shifting uncomfortably as this bear is like within a couple of feet of him. But yeah, it was wild. So Yosemite was a fantastic and bizarre and beautiful experience for me.
Beautiful, beautiful. And so whenever people who haven't spent a lot of time outdoors or hiked, the two questions you get are, do you carry a gun, or what about animals? So anything other than bears that you run across besides those pesky little mice that really bother you?
Right, yeah. Mice were the worst, of course. Mosquitoes were the worst. Mice were like second. But yeah, no. I didn't carry a gun. You do get that question a lot, but you're accounting for every gram of weight that you're carrying close to 3,000 miles over the course of the year, and a gun weighs like a ridiculously large amount. So no, I was just wandering around. Like I had my little pocket knife, and that was actually a pretty big weight expenditure. But the scarier thing for me, as opposed to bears, were actually cats. Mountain lions, and both of which they tend to leave people alone, but it gets really spooky, especially when you're hiking in cat country and at twilight, which is when they're the most active. So around mile 500 is where you get a lot of these mountain lion sightings. It's in the desert part of the PCT. And there was one night in particular where I was walking through the twilight and going up this really steep grade, and there were all these like massive footprints in the sand that were just obvious cats, like because they had no claw marks, just big lobes, and you could just see where they were wandering through the area. And there were a bunch of sightings that were reported on the GPS app that I used, which had comments from hikers. And so I got into my campsite that night, and I was like bent over, which you're not supposed to do. Like cats will attack you if you're running away or if you're bent over, because then they mistake you for kind of one of their prey animals. But yeah, it was already dark, and I will never forget the scream that like went through, that echoed through the mountains as something died, and I'm pretty sure it was a deer, because they have this like really awful scream as a cat killed them. So this was kind of the atmosphere that I was going into, and I had a really intense experience a couple of days later when I camped a little bit earlier when it was still light. And I was eating in my tent, which you're not supposed to do, but I was very tired, and it took me like an hour to chew at night just to get in the required amount of food that I was supposed to be taking in. And so I'm doing my evening, ritual of chewing and writing in my journal, and then like all of the hairs on my body stand up like all at once, and I didn't know why, but I had been listening to like the birds and the insects buzzing, and then suddenly it was dead quiet. And I was like, there is something terribly wrong. And then I hear this quick, heavy footstep as something comes up to my tent and then circles it multiple times. And I've got my little pocket knife, and I'm like, oh my God. I'm trying to Google, do mountain lions go into tents? And of course I had no service, so I didn't know. And I just
Wish I had a gun.
Right. And I just sat there or whatever, and turns out mountain lions don't tend to go into tents, so I made it through that night, but it was a wild encounter, and I saw a bunch of bears, and by and large, none of these animals really are aiming to hurt any person. Like every bear that I saw immediately turned and ran away from me, which was really sad for me because I wanted to catch a photo of one. And so I didn't actually have any real problem with the animals, but it is very scary, especially in the beginning when you're not used to being out around them. And then that fear kind of dropped off as I went along, and I started to hike more at night and feeling more comfortable, like I wasn't prey for something. So yeah, it was
Until you encountered a UFO.
exactly. Yeah, I did have one unexplained phenomenon. I'm a very logical and rational person, but there was one night when I was in Northern California, and it was this really long, beautiful sunset where I was on the eastern side of the mountain, and the sun was just clipping the edge of the mountain the way so that it turned the entire world like this pink and purple, but I was climbing with the sunset, so I kind of like existed in this long sunset. And by the time I got up to the top, it was just washed with all of this beautiful gold tone, all this light, and I was on this ridge, and I was days away from civilization. There were no roads, there was nothing there, just a big cliff over the mountains, and then long, pine trees behind me. And it was getting pretty late, and these big shadows were getting pushed into the pines, and it was feeling a little bit spooky, and so I was like, it's probably time to camp. And so I went back into the trees a little ways and set my camp up and got into my tent, and again went through this evening ritual of chewing and writing in my journal and listening to music, and then I was getting ready to go to bed, and I had a headlamp on, and suddenly from behind my tent, up in the air by where the trees were, this incredibly strong light shone down on my tent. I had this ultralight tent that was really, the material was really thin Dyneema, and it let a bunch of light through, but it was not clear enough that you could see things outside. You could just kind of see lights. And so it was this huge light that was shining down at an angle onto my tent. And I, again, like all of the hairs on my body stood up, and I was just like frozen because anything that was projecting light like that would have made a silhouette of me. And so I just like didn't want to move. And after a few seconds, or maybe like 30 seconds, that light, it didn't like suddenly disappear or like turn away. It closed like an eye and was gone. And throughout this entire period, there was no sound. Like it was dead silent in the forest. There was no sound of like a helicopter. There was no other way that I could explain it. It wasn't at a low level where it could have been a person. There were no roads for cars. I was at the top of the ridge, which was literally the highest thing aside from the trees. And I checked rocket launches when I got back into town because that's a frequent thing that shows up at night when you get weird lights. But yeah, I have no idea. It was just a big bright light that was really spooky and weird. And the light shut off, and I was like, well, if I wasn't on the trail and 150% exhausted, there's no way I'd be able to sleep tonight. And then I passed out. And I woke up in the morning and I was fine. So, what if it was something coming by, it didn't want me. That was good enough.
Yeah, so now people ask, you ever see any bears or UFOs when you're out hiking? Yeah. So one of the big terms is when you're out on the trail is everybody's got good days, everybody's got bad days, and they say don't quit on a bad day. And that's tough because I think about all the hardship you had, your first couple weeks, and then you get caught in the snowstorms, and then you're in the snow through the Sierra, and no food, and you can make that good or bad, but what keeps you going? So, did you have a bad day?
Yeah, I had a distinct low point on the trail, which for me was in the middle of Oregon. Oregon was really difficult for me for a number of reasons. In California, you have a lot of trail towns, so you can stop every 4 or 5 days. But in Oregon, those dry up. There are a few resorts, but I didn't have money to stay at a resort. And so I was just plowing through these 20-mile days, like every single day, and getting really tired without taking any zeros. And so, and then I linked up with a couple that I hiked with for a little while, and they were ultra marathoners, so we literally ran our daily mileage, and it was awesome. I really experienced that runner's high for the first time, which was great. But it put a different kind of load on my legs because I had been struggling with various overuse injuries, but this was the first time I'd ever gotten shin splints, which are awful. And I had heard people complain about them when I was in high school, and people on the track team would be like, my shin splints. But I was like, well, what are you talking about? And I totally feel bad about not taking them seriously because they're awful. And so I'm in the middle of Oregon, shin splints. I've parted ways with that couple, so I'm kind of having to get back into my own rhythm. The mosquitoes are horrible, and I had this one morning where I woke up and I had to go to the bathroom and went out of my tent or whatever, found my spot, dug a hole, had to take down my pants, and all those mosquitoes went right up into everywhere that you don't want to be. And I kind of went back to my tent, and I was like so frustrated and so tired. That was the only time that I thought, man, I just want to go home. Like, I don't want to be here anymore. And for me, that was a really big red flag, because I was really trying to keep my emotional center through this journey so that I wouldn't kind of fall off the deep end. And so I was like, okay, I have to take this seriously. I have to get through this problem. Let's think of how I can do that. I think I'll feel better if I get out of the wild for a little bit. Maybe carve out a little bit of time to take a couple zeros. I was really conscious of my time going north because you have to get to the end of the trail before the blizzard shut the North Cascades down, because that'll compromise your journey. And so I had to carve out time if I was going to take time off. So there's a tradition that a lot of people on the trail follow where they will stay up for 24 hours and hike and try to stay up that entire time. And it was something that I kind of wanted to do. It kind of fell into the theme of me, trying to prove to myself that I was still functional and robust and able to do adventure after my whole accident and everything. So I'd been kind of playing with the idea of doing that, and this seemed like it was the opportune time. So I was camped at this little lake in the middle of Oregon called Brahman Lake, which is like a postage stamp size lake. And I decided that I was going to hike out to Sisters, and it was 67 miles, and I was just going to do it in one shot. And that would get me 2 days worth of extra time. I would go enough during that 24 hours to have 2 full zeros that I could actually rest and relax in a hotel room and actually recover myself. And so I embarked on that journey, and it was awesome and difficult. And I hiked straight through night and then day and then another night, and it was awesome. It was during the middle of the Perseids meteor shower, so at night I'd look up and you'd get all these meteors going through the sky, and it was really beautiful. And so I go through this full 67 miles plus additional mileage, trying to get water and everything else, and I don't take a nap or anything. I felt pretty accomplished by that whole deal, but I was super exhausted and beaten down, and I had earned these 2 days of freedom to relax and recover myself. And so I get into the hotel room, I get groceries, I pour myself a bath, because that's my place in town, trying to soak my legs. And then I get a call on my phone, and it's my uncle, who I haven't heard from in 10 years. And he's like, your dad has died, and I've been trying to get in touch with you. And I was like, oh my God. And so instead of resting and relaxing for the next 2 days, I had to figure out how to process that, deal with the emotional upheaval, and figure out how to put his whole estate together, because I was his only heir, I was his only son, and he lived in Idaho, and we had a bit of a disjointed relationship. He was an alcoholic and everything, but he was always the force that I rebelled against in my life, and I didn't realize how much I needed that, and I had a lot of feelings about that from childhood. It was really difficult. I had this whole experience where I usually go into really logical mode when I have a serious emotional crisis or any sort of thing that I need to get through. And so I'm getting the cremation authorization form signed and trying to figure out all this paperwork and the logistics of how I'm going to get to Idaho and settle his estate. And I had the owner of the hotel was this man who didn't speak English very well and was really very brusque, and I really needed to print this form out so I could sign it and get it to the attorney so that my dad could be cremated. And I was like, can I please print this form? And he was like, did not understand me whatsoever. And I was like, okay, well, how can I say this different ways? And I really tried to work with him, and he got really frustrated, and eventually he was like, I understand that your dad is dead. And I was like, just frozen, and for some reason that was the moment that all those emotions just like folded in on me, and I just like broke down and ran out into this parking lot, and I'm like stumbling around this parking lot just like in tears, trying to piece together how I'm going to do this whole thing because I was so overwhelmed. And I ended up stumbling into this little chiropractor's office, and there were these wonderful ladies at the receptionist desk that were like, oh my God, how can I help you take care of what you need? And they got my form printed out, and I signed it, and I was able to scan it and get it up to where it needed to be. But it was really difficult. I hiked another 3 30-mile days to get up to my friend's house and rented a car and went to Idaho and processed my dad's estate, which took like 10 days because his filing system was to shove all of his documents into trash bags and shove them into the closet. And so going through that and all of his photos and everything else. And then I came back to the trail after that. But I'd been racing the fires up through California and Oregon this entire time, and I was staying about 2 weeks ahead of them. And the time off trail with my dad took about that exact amount of time. So I came back, and the wildfires were everywhere along the trail. So there was just dense black smoke everywhere, and ash would rain down on my tent, and it was this horrible toxic air that I would have to be, I'd like triple over my buff and wet it, and then wear that mask while climbing these 3,000-foot ascents, and it was really difficult. But it was like the environment had this shadow cast over it, this pall that was so reminiscent of my emotional state, and that's how I ended up finishing the trail. That I went through the rest of Washington under this like dark cloud as I was carrying some of my dad's ashes to spread up by Mount Rainier, which was his namesake, and then try to make it up to the border. But yeah, so that was my very long worst day.
Yeah. So you obviously you've pushed through. How's your body holding up during all of this as you're getting towards the end?
Oh, I was falling apart in so many ways. I started the trail at about 193 pounds. Right now I'm about 200, and I got down to 145 pounds by the middle of Oregon. So I was like 90% beard and had like no body fat. Right? You can't eat enough. Like I was burning about 6,500 calories a day, and I couldn't eat more than 3,500 calories worth of trail food. So you're slowly destroying your body as you go up the trail. It is a process of slow death. Like if you just continue doing that forever, you would just like fall over and die. But yeah, so it was really hard. And I had the shin splints, and I had my left quad felt like it was falling off. Like I had to bind it with 2 sock liners that I sewed together into a makeshift compression wrap. And I was literally hobbling up the last day. My final day on the trail it was a really big one because there was a huge blizzard that was coming in. And I'd been watching the forecast coming in. And so my last day I did 17 miles up to the border in Canada, and then I had to do an additional 30 miles back to Harts Pass, which is the closest roadway to in the United States, so that I could get a ride back into Seattle. And so I did that 47 miles on the last day, limping and just trying to get it back in before this huge storm shut the trail down. And I ended up getting into my tent at about 3 o'clock in the morning, camped next to a trail angel who had said that they were going to give me a ride into Seattle. And when I woke up, maybe a few hours after that, it was in the middle of a torrential storm, and I went into my tent dry, but I was in like a floodplain after that. And so anyway, I went out on this really triumphant high note for me. That was really wonderful. But that entire last section was really hard, and I was falling apart.
So you obviously completed the trail.
Yeah.
What was the time on your feet?
What was the?
And how long were you on your feet?
I started March 10th, and I believe I finished on September 27th. So it was about 6.5 months. I took a little bit of time off with the whole thing with my dad, and then I spent a little bit of time with my mom when I was going through Tahoe, because she lives in that area. And yeah, so it was. I think I was in my tent for like 180 nights or something like that. It was a long trip.
So it's obvious that beauty and hardship coexist, let's say. Taking on, by the time you finished, how did family members view you? How did you feel? I mean, so during this transition, did you see things? Could you feel things healing? Could you feel different? Did it wake you up? Talk about that for a little bit.
Yeah, so after my accident, a lot of the people that I was close to, like my mom, for instance, noted significant changes in my personality and kind of parts of that damage from that accident and hitting my head on the pavement. And I did feel like I was coming back to myself over the course of this long trip, to the point where when I did finish, people, like my mom again, remarked to me that it felt like I was back, like I had actually come back, which was awesome, because there was quite a bit of time there where I wasn't entirely sure I was coming back. You know, I started, before I started the trail, like my doctor was kind of pushing me towards, getting on federal disability and being like, this is who you are now. And I was in this tiny little place, and it just felt like the walls were closing in closer and closer. And then by taking this trip and really pushing through all the way to Canada, it felt like I broke that open and really kind of found myself again by the end there.
Because you said something really interesting last night when we were talking with your mom, and getting caught in that trap, which you didn't want to get caught in, the disability.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mentioned my dad, who, he was an alcoholic. Part of that was because he was in a really bad accident when he was in his 20s, where he had been digging a trench for a construction company, and it caved in on him and broke just about every bone in his body, shattered his pelvis. And then he really fell down that line, like into disability and kind of feeling like a victim, and really just letting his world shrink until he scarcely existed anymore in the way that he had before. And I really desperately didn't want that to happen to me. I really wanted to find some way back to a path that I liked, a future that felt like it had some brightness left to it. And so that was what drove me to continue on the trail through all of the hardships, all of the snowstorms and lack of food here and there, and all of the grueling mountains and injuries and everything else. I wanted to prove to myself that I would be able to recover, that I would be able to do hard things and still be a person without having to treat myself like somebody who was disabled. And I still have some residual TBI symptoms, and I have my own thresholds and everything else, but it's gotten a lot better, and hopefully it will continue to get better. And it does feel like there's a path open ahead of me now, at least. So.
Very cool. And so, not to backtrack, but to backtrack, you're in a room for 2 years, and then you tell your mom you're going to take off and hike 2,600 miles. Yep. I mean, how was that received?
Against all advice from everybody. I had virtually no one on board with this plan in the beginning, and but yeah, it was good. My mom was terrified, and my doctors did not approve, but everybody kind of respected that I was doing it for my own reasons, and they trusted me to try to do that. I mean, going into the wilderness solo, hike close to 3,000 miles in order to, while you have a traumatic brain injury, doesn't really seem like a smart thing to do, but I really felt like it was my path back to myself, and then everybody kind of got on board with that as we went along, and people were really supportive. I got lots of awesome support from trail angels like yourself. We met up by Tahoe, and Alan fed me one of those nights, which was awesome, and there were a ton of people that helped me along the way, and my friend Shelby, who sent me all those packages. It was great, but yeah, everybody was really freaked out, especially in the beginning.
And so during this pandemic, we were, seeing all the toxicity online, and it's just like, what do we do? Do we not do it? Do we do it? And my wife, she says, our number one goal is the hikers. So that first trip, Michael and I went up and set up. It's in the pandemic. We have no idea what's going to happen, and we have the stations of all the hand sanitizer set out and the masks and all of that. And Brandon was the first person that came through that year. And he walks up, and we're like 20 feet away going, would you like us to mask up? And he just goes, yeah, and gives us that. And it was such a sense of relief because it felt like some normality. So it helped us just as much as the food helped you, because it was like, oh my God, we don't have all this toxicity banging down on us, and nobody knew what was going on, so, it's, thank you. Thank you for that.
No problem. I was happy to have the food. I'd been in the woods for like 7 days before that and hadn't seen another person. Stumble out on a road, and there's 2 people with like a full grill that are grilling like hamburgers, and I got to eat green things, and I didn't even really remember what a green thing was at that point, so it was great.
So one of the things that we really admired when we first talked to Brandon was the fact that he got off trail and was able to be of service to his mother and his grandmother as she transitioned and became the caretaker and the hospice taker for him. And to find somebody with that heart, it's hard to find, So Brandon's mother's here tonight, lovely woman, and we just had a great time talking to her last night. So we got a couple more minutes. Do you have any stories that you feel like we've passed over that?
There were so many stories. That's difficult to narrow one down. Were there any aspects of the trail that, let's see, we covered pretty much everything. There were some really beautiful spots for me in the southern desert that were fantastic. You get the best desert sunsets ever. You get that just have those beautiful, brilliant purples and oranges. That was a really strong memory for me. It was great. All my stories are long, so I don't know if I could fit one into 3 minutes, but
no, we got 5 minutes if
okay.
you want to.
So let's see. One of my favorite days was in Yosemite, actually, and it was kind of interesting how you need to find your own flow when you're in the wilderness. And I had been with that group of people. There were 4 of us that went over the main set of mountains, like Forester and all the really highest, most dangerous ones. And then we kind of split up, and I finished the Sierras on my own. And it's always difficult when you part with people, and because you kind of start to rely on each other, and then being alone again, you have to find your rhythm. And it took me a couple days usually, but then I would find them, and I'd get really wild. Like my time journeying through the wilderness on my own would just get really silly. Like I had pareidolia really bad, which was where you see faces and like animals and stuff in random objects. So a tree that looked like an alligator that was smiling, or various other like weird things. And so that was kind of like my happy place. And I have a really distinct memory in Yosemite of going through these big long climbs where it was snowing, but just a little bit, which is my preferred temperature for hiking because I get really hot, and just going through these beautiful forests that are just resplendent with light, and the light snowfall, and I felt really good. Being in the middle of a long climb is like one of the best feelings. It's like that runner's high, and listening to music and thinking about stories and really being so enmeshed in this like natural moment. Like those, there was a lot of beauty on the trail. Like a lot of my story, some of the punch of it comes from how difficult things were. But to counterbalance that, it was really more beautiful than I can describe at the same time. It was always that really balanced dynamic between really beautiful moments and the difficult, like brutal elements as well that came together to create this experience that was just otherworldly. It was just fantastic.
Right on. Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
As mentioned, Brandon's going to finish us off with a little bit of closure, and then we're going to come back and we're going to take an intermission, and we're going to have a T&A or Q&A. So anybody that's willing, take a number. Sorry about that. So once again, we will put all the cards up here and then just throw them in the big bucket, and we're going to go through them, and we will answer as many as we can. So we know there's a lot of questions out there, and we'll just go from there. Cool. So thank you.
Okay. My struggles on the trail really became a reflection of the trauma that I experienced as a part of the accident. But while the injury was thrust upon me, this journey was one that I chose to undertake of my own volition, and it was one that I could actually succeed at as long as I had the grit and determination to continue. So where all the symptoms and the medical conditions were really nebulous and uncertain, the PCT provided this really clear goal and objective, and all I had to do was put one foot in front of the other to find one campsite and then another, all the way up to the border. And the mountains became these physical representations of that brick wall that had come up between me and my future when that car cut in front of my motorcycle. And so each time that I was able to climb one, over and over, I got, it seems like my way forward opened a little bit further. And while I was never able to put back together the shattered remains of my comfortable life that I had had earlier, I was able to move past the wreckage that I had left behind, because part of me had stayed with that accident over that 2-year period and was trapped on that little piece of paved road. But by the time that I got to Canada, my path forward was covered in dirt and surrounded in trees, and it ran alongside beautiful mountain vistas and burbling streams, and finally it felt like my future was brimming with possibility again. Can we run on the road?
So one of the things that we handed out on the way in is what's called the Hiker Trash Dictionary. We've had people over the last few years say, I didn't know a lot of the terms that the hiker was talking about, and that's their lingo on the trail. What we have after intermission is a pretty special video for that purpose. So don't miss it. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sierra. My trail name is Periscope. I want to tell you a little bit about Nobo and Sobo. So when you're Nobo, you're northbound, and when you're Sobo, you're southbound.
My name is Burn Unit, and my term is yellow blazing. Yellow blazing is when instead of hiking, you do this.
Cookie, and my term is Hiker Midnight. So Hiker Midnight, as soon as it gets dark, it is time to go to bed.
I'm Seabiscuit,
I'm Squeaks.
and we really care about LNT,
Leave no trace.
which means if anyone left trash around, gotta pick it up and hike it out.
name's Trenchfoot. My word for the day is bonus miles because I do a lot of extra miles a day because I go the wrong way so many times. So bonus miles it is.
Hi everybody, my trail name is Onward, and I'm a 58-year-old retired Army officer, and I'm also a lasher. A lasher is a long-ass section hiker, meaning somebody who hikes the trail in sections over the course of a few years. In my case, for example, I am hiking 1,090 miles of the trail this year, and I'm coming back next year to continue my hike. Those 1,090 miles are from Mexico up to South Lake Tahoe, and that makes me a lasher, long-ass section hiker.
My name's Update. My term is hike your own hike, HYOH. And it means hike the hike that you want to hike and don't judge others for hiking the hike they want to hike.
Hello, my trail name is Carmen San Diego, and my term is kedhole. And it's the thing you need to dig if you need to do this.
My name is Ranger, and my definition is yogi, which is when you try to persuade someone to give you something when you're on the trail.
Okay, hi. My trail name is Guppy, and my term is 0 and Nero. So a 0 is when you hike 0 miles in a day, usually because you're drinking beer all day in town and eating so much you can't hike. And then a Nero is when you hike almost 0 miles because you're trying to get to town to drink all the beer and eat food.
Hi, so I'm Eagle Eyes, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about a cold soak. So I have a peanut butter, or an empty peanut butter container, and so what I use this for is to cut back on cooking time. Like say during lunchtime, I'll take like say instant noodles, I'll add them here like in a soup base or whatever, and then I'll add water. And then when it comes to cooking time, like say dinner time, I'll go ahead and once it's like soaked for a few hours, I can cook it like in 5 minutes and that's it. And then I'm ready to eat my food.
Banana Man, and I'm from the Nana Planet, and this is Hiker Trash. Enough said.
Hi, my name is Door3, and my term is the trail provides. And that is when the universe / the trail gives you something that you've been needing, or a friend that you haven't seen in a long time, and you're just so thrilled to see them. Or a new pair of socks, which these don't do. There you go.
And I'm going to explain what pink blazing is. It's when you start hiking faster so you can catch up to whoever you have a crush on.
Hi, I'm Coal Miner Elmo, and my term is trail magic, which is this.
Here's where I turn into a mess. That was my father. Passed away 3 weeks ago. And was a huge supporter of what we do. Yeah. So, anyways. Here's a good one. It says, the first question, will the moderator please introduce yourself? My name is Alan Hammond, and I'm the director of Limit Situation Trail Magic, and director seems like a big word because we go out and feed people. We feed Pacific Crest trail hikers for approximately a month on the trail. We have 12 volunteers, which you saw interspersed through the video, that all help in some way or another, and especially Jan and Steve for all the cookies and brownies they cook, and everyone that puts the time and effort and money out of their pocket into this. It's a beautiful experience, and we don't ask anything from the hikers, and we won't accept anything from the hikers. So we get a lot of donation requests from them, and if you're on the trail, we just ask you to pay it forward, because at some point somebody's going to need some help somewhere along the line. So thanks for coming. This is a fundraiser for the PCTA, the Pacific Crest Trail Association, who maintains this trail, and so the proceeds from this goes to them. So thank you all for showing up. The other part of this too is we have a lot of empty seats here tonight, and some are unsold, but quite a few of them are sold for people who couldn't attend but wanted to give to the cause. So thank you if you know anybody that did that. We truly appreciate it. So, thanks. Back to Brandon. Here we go. We got a lot of questions here. Did you get lost?
Oh, all the time. No, the trail is marked with blazes that kind of keep you en route, but it has so many little branches that spin off and go in different directions down to lakes or, et cetera. You're almost always falling off the trail at one point or another. Fortunately, I had GPS. Like all of the old timers that did it, years ago, I have tremendous respect for it because it's not really very clear. But I'd always get a little bit off, and it'd start to feel like a different trail, like it wouldn't be as well worn, and I'd check my GPS and have to backtrack in a mile and go back around the other way. So.
Yeah. Inevitable, especially in the snow.
Oh gosh.
Yeah. It's like they say, footprints are not the sign of an intellectual life all the time, because so many people go that way and you just follow me like, well, now we're at a cliff. Are you grateful for the accident?
That's a rough question, but in some respects, yes. I mentioned that I've always kind of had more of a wanderer's soul, and I've always had real dreams of being an author. Like that's what I decided I was going to do with my life when I was 19. And so I've worked pretty much every vocation along the way to support my writing habit, and including working for the state, which was the big job that I actually really started to get comfortable into. And the accident really, I was really afraid of getting too comfortable and that consuming me, and then waking up 20 years down the line and being like, wait, what happened to all those dreams that I had? And so in some respects, the accident really provided a abrupt change of direction for me, away from that comfort in a way that was tremendously difficult, but also I am a little bit grateful for, because it rerouted me back onto the path of dreams by force, and now I'm writing more stories and books, and hopefully that'll take off eventually.
Very cool. Puts us in the path of opportunities that sometimes we didn't know were there.
Yeah.
Psychologically, did you get tested before and after the journey? I'm wondering if there are specific areas that have improved And what are you doing now to sustain those improvements?
I didn't get a rigorous psychological battery or anything like that. A lot of it was more experiential from my side and how I felt and the amount of or how distraught I was and tired and in pain all the time. And then the testimony from the people that knew me, which was surprising to me at times. Like I referenced my mom saying that she really noticed the change in my personality. And I was just struggling to even get along, so I wasn't really tracking that kind of stuff. And then it was other people that really kind of told me that things had changed afterwards and provided that outside insight. For me, I've been kind of struggling my way through the entire time, and things have felt like they're getting easier, but there weren't any scientific metrics for that. It was more just the people around me that were giving me feedback.
Very cool. And was there a moment or moments on the trail when you felt a shift, that you were turning a corner?
Yeah, the first time that I remembered the entire number of miles from Gut Hook and transferred it into my journal, which was about 1,000 miles in, I was like, oh, this is different. This has changed because I cannot overemphasize how bad my short-term memory was beforehand. It was that feeling where you walk into the kitchen and you're like, what was I doing here? And that was me going from room to room in my house, just never really knowing where I was intending to be. And so that shift in my memory and being able to remember those details was, I really felt that in the middle of the trail, and that was really impactful for me.
Very cool. Thank you. So that would probably answer the question, how did you know when you had a breakthrough? And you could write 3 numbers down in a row, right?
Yeah. Didn't take much. I was coming from a pretty harsh place.
Breakthrough.
Breakthrough.
Gonna go for 4 next week.
Yeah.
Yeah. The tale of today's talk is broken open. You feel, are you fixed fully, or is there still some things that need fixing? Because this was kind of a double innuendo title. Is when we spoke about it, we wanted to come up with one that, broken and then broken open, in the fact that we can all get broken in some way or another, but then how do we get broken over to the next level? So, do you feel you're fixed?
Oh, I feel like I have made significant improvement. I don't know if I'll ever, I don't think I'll ever be the person that I was before the accident to the same extent, but I like who I am now. And so there will always be room for me to continue growing. And I do a lot of stuff to promote my brain-derived nerve growth factor in order to try to knit together those remaining synapses and all that kind of stuff, but I can get into if people are interested. But so I'm always looking to improve, but I feel like I am myself again. I don't feel like there's anything left to be fixed, but I still have residual symptoms. I still have horrible headaches sometimes. I get weird and dizzy if I'm overstimulated to a degree, but yeah, so.
Yeah, he sent me a text a week ago, and we're going to have just a phone call, and he says, I've got a headache that's so bad I'm just trying not to be human right now.
Yeah. Trying not to exist. That's my headache mode. Yeah. Pretending I don't exist.
Someone just wanted to say thank you for the inspiration to move forward after trauma.
Thank you.
So what would you say to anybody that may have some neurological damage, somebody that maybe a TBI, any input?
I would say that there's always hope to recover, that just the way that the medical system is set up, which is kind of a constant triage, they really kind of give you that 18 months and then send you on your way. Similar to the way they sent me home after I got in that really bad accident because I wasn't bleeding on the CT. And it feels demoralizing to be boxed into this place where you still have a bunch of symptoms and it doesn't really feel like you're yourself, but you can still gain recovery after that. And I was in a TBI support group for a while, and there were people who were outside of their accident from 3, 5, 9 years, and they were all seeing a little bit of recovery over time. And And if you do use a remedial approach like this, where you're saturating your brain with oxygen, I think that can kind of hasten that curve and give you more of yourself quicker. But I think that there's always hope to continue that improvement over time. So don't give up. It's awful, but there's light out there to be found.
Very cool. Very cool. So how many visits did you have the first year? I mean, so you go home, nothing's bleeding, you're at home.
Yeah, and went back to the hospital about 2 days later, and it was like, I am not okay. And I remember standing in the ER, and I was literally swaying because I nothing was working, and I had this pounding headache, and it was awful. And that began a process where I went to the hospital like 40 something times with all the physical therapy and the CT scans and occupational therapy type stuff. Like it was like a full-time job for the next year, and I had a lot of help getting to and from, and it was rough. But that was the first part of that recovery process.
Have you been back on your bike?
No, I wish. I love motorcycles. I'd ridden for 12 years before going down in this accident. They were my freedom. They were that place that I really went to be free. I'd take off and ride around in the storms, and it was great. That wild part of me was fully fulfilled. But yeah, you're not supposed to have repeat head injuries, and so everybody that loves me is like, don't get on a motorcycle. And it was my only vehicle while I was living in Sacramento, and so I was in traffic all the time, and that's really sketchy because other drivers do not pay attention to motorcycles. Please look for motorcycles. It's really easy, even if yours is bright red, like people will still not see you and pull all the way out. And so I don't think I'll ever go back to riding in a city, let alone with it as my only vehicle, because I spent all of my money on a really nice motorcycle instead of like getting a crummy motorcycle and a crappy car. Like I was like 100% awesome motorcycle. So I might get another one if I move out to the country someday and can ride around on, vacant, rural roads. But as far as being in the city, no. And as far as it being my only mode of transportation, definitely not. But I'd love to be on one again. I miss it, but I'm trying not to like crack this whole thing open.
There's always a horse. So tell them about the gear you were wearing and how you think it may have saved you, may have not saved you.
I always wore full gear. Like that was really important. Motorcycles are very dangerous, and I was cognizant of that. So I had on like a $700 leather jacket and a $700 showy helmet that was like really nice, and I love both of those, and jeans and big boots, and yeah, if the way that the back of my helmet was like cracked in, it hit like right on my little Bluetooth accessory and like dented in the back of the helmet. If that had been my actual skull, like it just would have shattered and gone like scrambled eggs across the pavement. So wearing nice gear that's actually really rated to protect you is critical, and I totally wouldn't be here today if I wasn't. So.
Wow. Okay. I know you're a person who looks for answers with logic and more towards science. Did you ever feel a moment where an answer was spiritual or divine out on the trail?
I feel like there was a lot that was spiritual. My spirituality is kind of logical, but I process things from that level. Like if nature is kind of my church, to make that reference. And so there was a lot of that deeply felt emotional resonance that supersedes kind of normal thought and logical processing. There was a lot of that. Like you're enmeshed in these wonderful, like beautiful spots in nature, in these forests with like all this light, and it's amazing. And those experiences definitely transcend any sort of normal processing. You can only be interpreted on an emotional level, and there were some really wonderful emotional moments throughout that processed more on that like base spiritual element.
Very cool. Did you take those pictures that were on the screen, and how many, what kind of camera and how many pictures?
Yes, I took all of those photos. I took 20,000 photos on the course of the trip. I wanted to take a nice camera, like I have a nice Nikon, but the weight is a lot, like over 3,000 miles. So I took them all on my iPhone and then spent a ridiculous amount of time in Photoshop, like getting them upscaled and put back together. So it took a couple hours per photo, but yeah, out of the 20,000, I selected, I think, about 700 that I posted online, which I believe you guys have been getting to watch. So yeah, it was great. There were times like on Forester where I could only go about 100 feet without taking another photo. And if I was hiking with somebody, they'd get like really frustrated with me. And I was always like running to catch up. I'd be like, no, I must capture this and take a bunch of photos. So yeah, those are all mine.
Right on. And so where can people see these?
Yeah, so I'm on social media. I'm most active on Twitter and Instagram. My handle is at my full name, Brandon Case 101. So you can find me there, and then brandoncase.net. I have a website that is still under construction and has been for the last year or so. So I'll put that together eventually. But yeah, please come find me and connect. That would be awesome.
If you know, have the doctors changed their opinion about the therapeutic value of your decision to do this?
I mean, I think so. I think there's been a pretty strong body of evidence that I saw quite a bit of recovery during this trip that was in excess of what was expected. And so I don't think that anybody has collated that data and made a research study about it or anything. I would be happy to participate in one if anybody has those connections, but I think that it is changing. And like if I had a bunch of money, the thing that I would donate to would be to further research into traumatic brain injuries so that we had more modalities and more understanding about how the brain actually heals and comes back together after all of these injuries, and more awareness, because it's such an invisible injury. Like, you don't have like a missing leg. Everything is contained within your own self and your pain and your perception of the world, which gets all addled, but nobody else can see that from the outside, which is incredibly frustrating. So I hope that it has changed some people's minds on what is possible in this kind of recovery, but not a lot of documentation just yet.
Same question. I get caught up in your answers. Are there any articles, or will there be a book? We would love to hear the full story.
Yeah, I kind of went through and posted the entire thing on social media, which comes directly from my journals, because I kept like a 70,000 word journal. So if you want to scroll back 700 posts, like I have every photo up there with a caption that describes it, and it's posted chronologically going north, because I really wanted to capture, like, my goal was to hike every step of the trail going north, which I was really lucky in being able to do. So it's kind of chronologically going north, but yeah. And then I'm thinking I'll probably write it into a memoir. There's definitely, we've only scratched the surface of my stories here today, so there's a lot more that I'd be excited to share. And I've written a couple of books so far. It would be really cool to put this whole experience together and maybe see if I could get a publisher interested in it.
Right on. Because someone also asked, are you on tour?
Oh, that'd be cool. No, so far it was just Alan, because I came out and did a Q&A for him after the showing of Wild, and then he was like, we need to show your story to more people, and so here I am. But yeah, tour would be cool.
Yeah, because we had another topic in mind, my wife and I, after we wait and go through the summer, and the trail will bring us a topic. And if you haven't been to the last ones, like last year, we had the retirees that hiked, and we've had solo women and their stories. We had the high snow year group, and so when the theater here had asked us to come up and put a little panel together, and with BCTA, I think 5 people showed up and all of that, and they'd ask a question, and then the mic would go down the line. Well, nobody wanted to talk after Brandon. They're all like, so we're like, that guy needs to do a show, Thank you for your service. What was your favorite food in the mountains?
Oh, that's rough. I really loved those trout when I was really hungry, because they say hunger is the best spice, and that is true. But there were a couple. One of my favorite ones was in Oregon. I went on this really long stretch where I was getting really tired and my body fat was down to almost nothing. And I came into this little resort town, and they had a grill where a guy was cooking hamburgers or whatever, and they were pretty cheap. And I like my meat really rare. And so he obliged me and gave me a really rare burger, and he gave me, they were supposed to be half a pound, but they were more like 3/4. They were like falling over the edges of the bun. And then he gave me a second patty for $1.50. And so I had like 1.5 pounds of meat. And I sat there and ate the entire thing just in absolute bliss. And it was an amazing moment.
So do you care to share how you eat?
Sure.
This caught us off guard on the trail. So
yeah, well, I've been interested in diet and health and all that stuff for a very long time. And so about 16 years ago, when I was living in Los Angeles, I picked up an unusual dietary practice, which is pretty much all raw, which is getting to be somewhat normal, but this is raw with a decent amount of animal products. And the thrust behind it, the raw meat gets like a lot of attention, but really it's about not cooking fat, because when you cook fat, it raises the melting point to where it's no longer necessarily a liquid in your body, and then it binds to minerals that cause arterial plaque, and that causes a bunch of the degenerative diseases that we know. And so it's this big long thing, but yeah, so I try to eat pretty much all raw, and as much as possible stay ketogenic, and that's what I do. It's been working for me for a long time now.
So that is raw chicken, raw beef, raw steaks.
Yep. Just no pork. Trichinosis is no joke.
And I love what you talked about, the fact that sometimes it's not really fresh, and you're just working up your immune system.
It's like in nature. Like the analogy that I like to use is how in Wyoming they took all of the wolves out. They killed all the wolves, and then the deer population exploded to the point where deer were eating so much vegetation that the rivers spilled from their banks and turned into these big wandering waterways that were just eroding the land and doing all this damage. And it was because there were no predators to keep the deer in check, because normally there's a balance in an ecosystem. And so for me, I try to have as much bacterial diversity in my intestinal flora as possible, because that way there's no chance for one bacteria to bloom and cause an overgrowth of like Salmonella or E. coli, because that's where you start running into problems. Those bacteria produce metabolites as a byproduct of their living. They're not trying to attack you or anything, but when their population explodes, then you get sick. And so my strategy with that is to have, yes, E. coli, yes, Salmonella, but a whole bunch of other stuff that all try to outcompete each other until everything's kind of in a harmony. And I haven't gotten sick from eating meat in all of the various stages of decay, despite doing this for the last 16 years or so.
Wow, awesome. I don't think I'm going to go home and try to eat raw chicken.
That is A-okay.
Sushi sounds good.
We can have a long talk about how that actually works if you want to approach that. But
can you please summarize your equipment, the big three: GPS, etc., camera, food, weight, favorite item, luxury?
Luxury. So for me, I did, my big three were all from Z-Packs, which is a cottage company that makes awesome gear. I had their duplex tent, which is a 2-person tent, and I'm kind of tall, so being able to sleep diagonally, I wasn't touching the walls. And in order to get that tent, which is like a $700 tent, I got a really good discount on Black Friday where they had $300 off. So if I got my backpack and my quilt with them too. So I had my big three were all from them. And they were great. They were expensive, but when you spend 180 nights out on the trail, it's like renting a room every night for like $4. So it becomes fairly economical over time. But so those were my big three. Everything else, like I carried Murano wool underlayer that I wore only in the tent that went in my dry bag. With my quilts, I had a trash compactor bag that went at the bottom of my pack. I had odor-proof sacks for my food and my trash, and a bunch of equipment for connecting my electronics and everything else. We can kind of if you're really interested, I'll give you a detailed breakdown of all that kind of stuff. And then I had a few luxury items. One was that little pocket knife that I carried with me. That's technically non-essential, but made me feel much better when I was huddled in my tent when predators were prowling. And I carried a solar charger through the High Sierra, which was a bit of a luxury because it weighed like a pound. But that helped me because, especially with COVID, we were going, all the side trails were shut off, so we went 10-day periods in the Sierra without going out to resupply. So we were carrying like 55-pound packs, and you had to recharge during that period, so the solar charger came in handy. But yeah, so those are my big three. My base weight, I think in the Sierra, it was probably like 13 pounds. Outside of there, probably maybe like 10. I was really trying to keep it light. And running around, my pack was probably about 25 pounds generally.
Very cool. Do you have a trail name? And if so, how'd you get it?
Yeah, my trail name was Pine, which came from an experience shortly before I got to Kennedy Meadows, which is the start of the High Sierra section. I love natural food, and I did so much foraging. I was the happiest whenever I could find food in nature. The blueberries in Washington, the trout, and just before I got to Kennedy Meadows, these big storms had come through earlier, the ones that dumped on me in San Jacinto, and it caused all of the pinyon pine trees to drop their pine nuts, and then started them sprouting. So pine nuts are really expensive. Sprouted pine nuts are like $50 a pound, and they're almost impossible to buy. So I like stuffed like a gallon bag full of pine nuts, and then I just like ate them continually, and I brought them into Kennedy Meadows with me, and there were a bunch of other hikers there, and this one guy that I had met and was like teasing me and wanting to call me Pine Nut, and I was like, well, I mean, that's kind of cute, but you know, he was really emphasizing the nut part, and I was going into the trail with a brain injury, and I was like, not really feeling it. And so this old German guy was like, just Pine, strong name. And I was like, I'm sold, like that's it. So I was Pine for the rest of the trail.
Younger crowd probably doesn't remember Yule Gibbons. And that would have been the perfect name, yeah. What was the process that led you to want to hike the PCT? Were you inspired by other hikers or friends?
Yeah, so for me it was having that intersection between going to Oregon with my friend when she had a little trip for vacation, seeing the PCT, and then seeing the Reddit post that for someone with a brain injury who hiked that saw extra recovery after doing this, really ridiculous and hard thing. And so it was really those three things that came together. A lot of people want to hike the trail and carry that with them as like a lifelong dream that takes them years to, plan and kind of accommodate towards. And that really wasn't the way that the trail found me. Like it was that one confluence of factors, and then 6 months worth of research, and then I was standing on the Mexican border waiting to go up the trail.
That someone had talked about, there's organizations. We have run into quite a few people with Warrior Expedition that they work with vets, and they find out where they would best be suited to work with their PTSD. And so we will have group of vets come through that are hiking the Pacific Crest Trail, but at every town that they do have to resupply in, like the VFW is waiting for them to feed them and house them and all that. So there are organizations out there that use the PCT as a healing opportunity. And we do get to see quite a bit, because our philosophy is, when we're not out there to have a party, we're out there to feed hikers, but as Michael says, it's just service without attachment. So if you can leave yourself at home and just be there for the people, then we can create a safe, open space for the hikers to where they can come in and there's no demands on them at all. So we're not serving alcohol, we're not playing music, any of that stuff. So what that does is allows a little bit of solace in the hikers, who always will at some point come up to us with their problems. And what we say is, the problems you have are exactly what we need. And that's what we get out of it. Okay. Brandon, what is your path now? What is next?
So I've really kind of lately been focusing on writing, and been doing a bunch of short stories. I've actually gotten about 7 of them published in the last year, which is a long time coming. Next, I'm probably going to write this whole experience into a memoir, and then try to see if I can get a publisher interested in that, and if not, self-publish it online. I'm applying to a number of writing workshops. There's one in San Diego that I might be in this next summer, and from there, I'm kind of back on the adventure. I might be headed up to Seattle, or maybe spend some time in New York City, somewhere with a good writing community and a bit of adventure, and kind of see where life takes me at this point.
So another long trail, question mark?
I'm not sure. It's when I got off of the trail, I would have said no. Everything hurt, and I was like half dead, but it didn't take long for that itch to kind of set back in. If I do another long trail, it'll probably be the CDT, which is probably the most wild of the 3. And that sounds like fun. That's the only one that you can see a grizzly bear on. And I love bears. I didn't talk too much about my bear experiences, but yeah, so if I hike another long one, it'll be the CDT.
So give us a bear experience.
Okay, so I ran into bears 4 times, and the first one was just amazing and magical. It happened actually pretty close to Tahoe. I made a lot of noise on the trail just by, mechanism of walking and crunching, and you've got poles and everything else. Plus, you're rather odoriferous, and so they can smell you from quite a ways away. So I would hear, big animals running away from the trail from time to time, but I'd gone like a long ways without seeing a bear, and I really wanted to. That was one of the main goals that I wanted for the trail. And so I was getting kind of upset about it. Like, I was like, where are these bears? And I was trying to walk really quietly. And then when I was up on, I think I was on the Tahoe Rim Trail, that there's this bend where the trail's going up and around, and I heard something big crash and go through the underbrush. And I was like, I missed another bear. But I kept going up, and there was a little stream that was like babbling over the rocks. And that was masking the sound of my footsteps enough that when I came up this curve, I came face to face with 2 bears, and they were almost me to you in terms of the distance. And it was really wild, because all the bears that I saw were black bears, because there aren't any grizzly bears or anything that are this far south. But none of them were actually black colored. They were all either cinnamon black bears, which are like a nice brown color, and one of the 2 that I saw there were, and then the other one was this really pale, almost white. And so it was really a surreal moment when I came around this corner, and my first thought was, you are not big enough to be a grizzly bear. And then the second thought was, you are really not big enough to be a polar bear. And then within the frame of that, like 1 second, they turned and ran downhill at like 30 miles an hour, before I had a chance to like get my camera out. So it was a cinnamon black bear and a Kermode bear, and there's like a very, very small population in the Tahoe area of these all-white bears that are somewhat more common up north. And so it was cool. I saw those bears. I saw another bear up by Belden where there were all these comments on Guthook talking about this big gangster-ass black bear that was like wandering around that people were like seriously afraid of. And I was sitting on this ridge, and I'd just gotten enough service to call down and book a hotel or a motel in Belden so that I could stay and have like a little bit of a rest. And so I'm on this ridge, and I'm sitting down and on the phone. And in that time that I was sitting down, this bear came up the ridge behind me, and I didn't hear him, and he didn't hear me. And then we turned and again looked at each other, and we were like really close. And then he turned and ran downhill, and it sounded like an avalanche, like he was this wall of flesh that was tearing down this slope and causing all this destruction. And of course, I like immediately jumped up and caught my camera out, and then like ran down the trail, and I found his footsteps where he had rejoined the PCT, and I followed him with recording video for like 20 minutes trying to get a shot of him, but he had disappeared into the wild somewhere. And it wasn't until 50 miles before Canada that I finally saw a bear who, again, ran away from me, but by this point there were so many blueberries everywhere that he went into a blueberry field and immediately got distracted and started eating blueberries. So I was able to get my phone out, and I got a video of him wandering through, all ready for winter and just eating all these blueberries. It was very magical. So,
right on. Yeah. Before we wrap it up, I just want to take a minute, which I don't know if I did last year, and I don't think I did, and thank people, the locals like Outdoor Herbivore, who supplies us with so many meals to hand out to hikers that are running low. So if you need any hiking food, check out Outdoor Herbivore. And then last year, Auburn Running Company, right up here in Old Town, supplied us with brand new shoes to give to hikers that needed shoes. So between Outdoor Herbivore, Auburn Running Company, and Darn Tough Socks, because we swap out the socks for hikers whose socks are giving out or have holes in them, turns into a pretty magical experience, when they can throw all you can eat on top of that. So, yeah, it's a good stuff. So thank you to everybody that has supported us in that role. What would you like to say to people about your experience? Do you have anything that you'd like to leave them with?
Just that everything, you have more in you than you know. Like going into this experience, I had no idea that I would be able to make it all the way from Mexico to Canada. Like that's, especially with the unusual circumstance that I was in. And as you start going, it hurts. Everything hurts. And there's always this voice in there that's like, you should probably stop doing this. This is kind of insane. But I and you are more capable physically, especially, and mentally, of doing things that are hard than you would think. It just takes realizing that. And so that was one of the big epiphanies for me that really kind of shaped the way that I look at myself, is this whole process of pushing through all of that hardship and doing something that was really rigorous and intense and I wasn't entirely sure was possible, really kind of reframed what I thought that I was capable of in a really positive way that has had a lasting impact on me. And so hopefully everybody's able to find that somewhere. It doesn't have to be the PCT that shows that to you, but it's an empowering moment to realize that you're capable of more than you thought you were. And I really found that, and I hope other people do too.
And that's, Larry asked this on one of our shows a couple of years ago. And real quick, thank you to KVMR too for the time he spent with us yesterday on air. It was beautiful. It helps us gel and get a direction, so thank you, Larry Hilberg. How do you feel about your journey?
I feel good about it. It took me a long time to kind of acclimate to coming through it. I was so broken down by the end of it that it was like 90% relief that I was just not having to walk anymore. And that kind of persisted for a little while. It usually takes me a little while to process things emotionally, but it has become an enduring source of comfort and a yardstick that I can measure life against. A testament to the fact that I am still capable of doing awesome adventure-y things, and I can choose my own path and not let an injury or people's expectations about what I should be define me. I can lit off into the wilderness and go hike, 2,600 miles and kind of redefine myself, and that has been that has been awesome. So I feel really grateful to have gotten to hike the PCT, and really lucky in the events that put together my ability to continuously hike it up. It's much harder with all the fires that are going on and everything else. So I feel very lucky and grateful, and really, I don't know, proud that I was able to do that. It's been a source of inspiration for me.
Yeah, I don't want to speak for the audience, but we're proud of you.
Yeah.
I mean,
Thank you.
it's unbelievable. So, Brandon Case 101 on Instagram.
Various platforms, yeah.
And we thank everybody for coming here, and Brandon's available to chat if anybody needs to chat or wants to chat afterwards. If you want to sit in a chair and talk to him, that's like 25 cents an hour. Yeah.
Funding the next hike.
Yeah, but down there it's free. So we thank you for coming, and we truly appreciate it, and be on the lookout for what comes up next year.